In the previous video, we talked about how we measure and assess personality, which is not as easy as it seems. Now, we turn our attention to different theories of personality itself. There's actually no single overarching theory of personality. Instead, there are several different perspectives that each emphasize different things, and I'll be covering two of them in this module. First, I'll start with a historical perspective, the psychodynamic perspective developed by Sigmund Freud. As we'll see, Freud had some interesting ideas and a lasting impact on the field, but much of his theory has not been scientifically supported today. So in the next video, I'll talk about how psychologists today view personality. Whenever I meet someone new, I always kind of dread the part when I have to explain that I'm a psychology instructor, and it's because I almost always get the same kind of response. It's usually something along the lines of, "Oh, are you psychoanalyzing me right now?" And I always cringe at this for a couple reasons. First, what people usually mean by this statement is that they think I'm trying to figure them out or diagnose them in some kind of creepy way, and I'm definitely not trying to do that, nor could I do that, even if I wanted to. The fact that I'm a psychology professor doesn't give me any unique or special insight into people any more than anyone else, especially not after only having talked to them for a few moments. Second, even if I was in a professional clinical setting where I was actively trying to diagnose a patient, I wouldn't be using psychoanalysis to do so. Almost no reputable psychologist today still considers psychoanalysis to be a valid clinical perspective. However, the fact that almost everyone I meet outside of psychology has the same response when learning about my profession demonstrates the enduring reach of Sigmund Freud and his psychodynamic theory. Perhaps one of the most recognizable psychologists today, Sigmund Freud in his own time was actually a neurologist working in Vienna in the late 1800s and early 1900s. His work with his patients led him to speculate about the importance of childhood events and unconscious thoughts and desires. Freud had a lot of ideas about personality and psychopathology. Collectively, these ideas came to be known as the psychodynamic perspective. The psychodynamic perspective has several key ideas, and I'll highlight just a couple of them in the remainder of this video. A first major part of Freud's theory was his structural model of the mind. Specifically, Freud thought that the mind was divided into three main components: the id, the ego, and the superego. Let's look more now at each one. According to Freud, the id was comprised of people's instinctual drives and desires. The id operates based on the pleasure principle, meaning that it's always seeking immediate gratification of desires without much regard for long-term consequences. In contrast, Freud thought that the superego represented people's conscience. The superego operates based on the morality principle. It's always looking to do the moral or right thing in a given situation. Because the desirable thing to do and the right thing to do are rarely the same thing, it's not hard to see how the id and superego are often in conflict. Sitting in between the id and the superego is you, the ego. If the id is the proverbial devil on someone's shoulder and the superego is the angel, then the ego is the person, him or herself in the middle, who ultimately has to decide what to do. The ego operates based on the reality principle. The ego ultimately has to try to find a way to satisfy the demands of both the id and the superego, and do it in a way that is also realistic and feasible, which is no easy task. For this reason, Freud compared the ego to a chariot driver trying to control two wily horses who often want to run in opposite directions. It's the ego's job to rein them both in and keep the chariot going on an even keel. Freud also thought that the id, ego, and superego operate at different levels of consciousness. Here, you can see Freud's famous iceberg model. In this graphic, any part of the iceberg that is above the waterline represents what a person would be consciously aware of, whereas anything beneath the water represents what would be part of their unconscious. As you can see, the ego is mostly conscious, as it is shown above the waterline. And this is helpful because more so than the other two mental structures, the ego is responsible for navigating the constraints of the person's reality. In contrast, Freud thought that a person's id was entirely unconscious. Freud thought that this was because many times a person's instinctual drives and desires were experienced as inappropriate and anxiety-producing. Therefore, he thought that people buried these urges deep beneath their conscious awareness. Importantly, just like the majority of a real iceberg is underneath the water, so too Freud thought that the majority of a person's personality was buried underneath the surface in their unconscious. Freud thought that this was because most people repressed anything uncomfortable, including fears, anxieties, traumatic memories, and inappropriate desires, and kind of locked those in their unconscious, so to speak, so that they did not have to consciously be aware of them. However, Freud thought that these unconscious desires could still sometimes unintentionally slip out and reveal themselves in a person's thoughts and behaviors, and this is actually where the term Freudian slip comes from. For example, imagine the potentially embarrassing situation where you accidentally call your current romantic partner by your ex's name. Freud would believe that this was no accident. Rather, he thought that such instances were evidence of your unconscious desires for your ex slipping out and manifesting in your speech. Today, our understanding of personality has evolved quite a bit. First, most psychologists today don't use terms like id, ego, and superego. Although it's true that we sometimes have competing pressures or desires, it's unlikely that we have an entire part of our mind or personality that is solely dedicated to seeking pleasure or solely dedicated to doing the morally right thing. Instead, everyone has many goals that they are simultaneously trying to pursue, such as both a goal to do well in school as well as a goal to be a generally honest person. Everyone has different goals that they are more or less successful at pursuing and that they prioritize differently. Secondly, it is true that we have implicit or non-conscious processes, such as procedural memories, that we talked about in Module 5. However, this is typically how we think about non-conscious processes today. We don't think about the unconscious in the same way that Freud did, as kind of a repository for our darkest fears and desires. For more info contrasting how psychologists today view the unconscious, you can check out the supplemental video in Canvas. Let's pause for an application practice question. Cassandra is tempted to cheat on an upcoming exam. According to Freud, Cassandra's blank is tempting her to cheat, while Cassandra's blank is telling her that this is wrong. The answer is C. Cassandra's id is tempting her to cheat, while Cassandra's superego is telling her that this is morally wrong. Although Freud proposed that the unconscious could sometimes subtly slip out, he thought that in general the ego worked hard to keep unwanted feelings, memories, and desires from reaching conscious awareness. Specifically, Freud hypothesized the existence of various defense mechanisms, or mental strategies that the ego uses to deal with threatening situations. Freud's daughter, Anna, later expanded on these ideas, adding some additional defense mechanisms of her own. In total, Freud and his daughter proposed the existence of around a dozen or so different defense mechanisms, and I'll cover just 4 of them in this video. The most basic defense mechanism is simply that of denial. That is, denying that the threat or source of the anxiety exists. As we will see, every other defense mechanism involves some form of denial because every defense mechanism involves denying reality in some way. When someone uses the defense mechanism of denial, they are using it in this most basic way, simply denying that something is true. This might be seen, for example, in someone with an addiction who adamantly denies that they have a problem, saying, "I can stop anytime I want." The notion that the person might have an addiction is psychologically threatening, so the ego simply denies that this is true. Another example of denial might be if a couple breaks up and one person in the couple refuses to believe that this really happened, continuing to act as if they are still together, even when they're not. The next defense mechanism that I'll talk about is repression. And it's similar, but it specifically has to do with forgetting. So, for example, Freud thought that people could repress traumatic memories, such as being bitten by a dog when they were younger, and later the person might have a fear of dogs without knowing why. Repressed memories are a very popular idea in today's culture, so it might surprise you to learn that there's actually no good scientific evidence that they are real. So what about people who have claimed to recover so-called repressed childhood memories? Well, there's no way to know for sure, but remember from Module 5 that we can actually create vivid false memories. That is, we can be subtly coerced into remembering things that never actually happened. And in fact, many reportedly repressed memories are recovered in highly suggestive environments, such as during hypnosis. Because of this, any supposedly recovered memory in adulthood should be heavily fact-checked with independent sources to verify its authenticity, especially if it involves accusing someone else of a crime. For a video that talks a little bit more about repressed memories and what modern research has found, you can check out the SciShow supplemental video on Canvas. Another defense mechanism is projection, which involves taking uncomfortable impulses off of the self and placing them onto other people. So, for example, if you were cheating on your spouse, you might accuse your spouse of being the one that's actually unfaithful. Or a person who is insecure about feeling unattractive may point out others' physical flaws and call them ugly. A final defense mechanism we will talk about in this video is rationalization, which has to do with making excuses for one's behavior. So, for example, someone who is cheating on their partner may rationalize it by saying that what the other person doesn't know won't hurt them. Or someone who steals from a store may rationalize it by saying that the small item they took is not really going to hurt a large company's overall profit margins. Okay, let's pause for a final application practice question. Stefan has a drinking problem, but he thinks that since his girlfriend is on social media all the time, she's really the one with an addiction problem, not him. This best exemplifies which of the following defense mechanisms? The answer is B, projection. The defense mechanisms can be a little tricky to get the hang of at first because they all have related elements, and remember that every defense mechanism has a little bit of denial running through it. However, the best answer here is projection because Stefan is seeing his own problem of addiction in someone else's behavior. So, where does the psychodynamic perspective stand today? Freud was exceptionally famous and influential even in his own time, and as my story at the beginning of the video demonstrates, that influence continues even today in our popular culture. However, Freudian ideas are not really well respected anymore in the scientific community. Freud was not a big believer in the scientific method, so many of his ideas can't even be tested in an empirical way, and those that can be tested, for the large part, have not been supported by empirical data. In fact, I haven't covered several other aspects of Freud's theory in this video, such as the psychosexual stages of development, because frankly, they're kind of weird and there is absolutely no support for them today. However, in his theorizing, Freud was one of the first to emphasize the importance of childhood events for adulthood personality, as well as the importance of unconscious processes. So it turns out that Freud was kind of right on a couple things, at least in a very broad sense, even though many of his specific ideas have turned out not to be true. So the next time you meet a psychologist or a psychology professor in real life, please don't make a joke about them psychoanalyzing you. Trust me, they're not. In this video, I discussed Freud's psychodynamic perspective of personality. For the exam, you should be able to define and distinguish between the id, ego, and superego, and identify the roles of each component and which components are thought to be relatively more conscious or unconscious. Define defense mechanisms and distinguish between the 4 defense mechanisms that we covered in this video: denial, repression, projection, and rationalization, and be able to identify each one in an example. And discuss which aspects of Freud's psychodynamic theory have been supported by scientists today and which have not.